Welcome to the Talking Serverless podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Jones, joined today by Franck Pachot. Franck is an AWS Hero, Oracle ACE Director, as well as an Oracle Certified Master with over 20 years of experience in development, data modeling, infrastructure, and all DBA tasks. It's no surprise that Franck is recognized as an expert across Oracle, Postgres, and AWS. Currently, Franck is a developer advocate at Yugabyte, an open source cloud native distributed SQL database. And you can also keep up with him on his blog, Twitter, podcast, and all that info, of course, will be given in the show notes. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. How are you doing today, Franck?
Good, very good. It's the evening for me. I'm based in Switzerland.
Yeah, that's so cool. For me, it's 2:30. I'm out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, so here in Puerto
Yeah.
Rico. Yep. Yeah. So I guess jumping straight in. So you're doing good. What is that? How long have you been in Switzerland, and what is it like working up there?
I'm French. I've been working in different countries in Europe and Africa. And I'm in Switzerland for 10 years, and I think I will stay a long time there. Before I was moving a lot, but I'm really happy there.
Yeah, that's awesome. My hope is to get up to Europe and then go to all the different countries, and definitely Switzerland is very high on that list. So that's awesome. Yeah, so it's cool to have you on. We haven't had a lot of people that specialize in databases, so I'll do my best to represent like a good side. But if any of my comments are somewhat uneducated, please, definitely feel free to jump in and correct me for the audience. On that note, getting into it. How did this whole thing start? How did you get into tech? What led you to it? Did you learn about it when you were very early on in school? Was it something you got onto later on in college? And how did it eventually lead to AWS databases and so on?
Yeah, so basically, I've always worked with databases. And yeah, always around databases. After university, my first internship was development with a vehicle, and then I've done some development, client server development at that time with a vehicle as well. Some with DB2, so those old databases. I've done a lot of data warehouses because those projects were quite interesting. You touch to all data from the enterprises, and you directly talk to users and developers, and so that was interesting. And then slowly, so this was mostly in development, and I learned databases because I had to install it. At that time we had no cloud, so if a small team wanted to start an application on a database, you needed to install and unbox a server and install software on it, and learn about network, about storage, and all those things. And then finally, I became a DBA. Not like I wanted to become a DBA, but I was more and more involved in understanding how the database works. And then you need also to understand how the backups works, not only the application, for example. And mostly I've done all this in consulting companies. So either for small projects during many months, or after the DBA, a few days of expertise, especially tuning. I like performance tuning because it's a good occasion to talk to operations and developers. So mostly in consulting companies. So finally, what I started 4 months ago is totally out of my zone of comfort because I'm not a consultant anymore. I'm not going at customers, and I'm working on a different database. But behind that, the concepts and the ideas are the same. And about the advocacy programs like AWS Hero or Oracle ACE Director, I started to share what I was learning in forums, for example. But for me, it was more a way to learn. When I was a developer and starting to understand how the database works, answering questions was my way to force myself to learn. And because there are things you think you know, but when you answer a question, publicly in a forum, you need to validate it, and then you need to go to the documentation and maybe test it before answering. And this forces you to do that. And then I started blogging a bit with the same idea, and also for self-documenting my learnings. And usually, when you learn things and you share it, it's useful also for others. So it encourages you to continue. And this is where I've been also to conferences. And I was working a lot with Oracle database at that time, and then I went in the advocacy program, the Oracle ACE, which is a way also to meet other people at conferences. I mean, you don't need this kind of program to meet other people, but it helps. And I've seen that at Oracle. And when I started to work on AWS, still databases. The services I know in the AWS are mostly databases. And again, I quickly was admitted in the AWS community and as a data hero from what I've shared about Aurora or DynamoDB. And this is where you really see that it helps to meet people, because in the Oracle area, I was knowing a lot of people. I mean, the Oracle advocacy program was helping, but I didn't need it to contact product managers at Oracle or things like that. But I was new in AWS, and the Heroes program helped me to meet people out of my database zone. This is where I've met more serverless developers, for example, because when you work on the database, you are usually far from. Today it has changed, but a few years ago, for example, you didn't put databases on Kubernetes. You didn't think about a serverless database because a database needs a server and you cannot stop it. You need to know where are your data and all that. So those things changes with the evolution of containers and with the cloud. And with AWS Hero, I had very good discussion with people not so familiar with databases, but interaction between developers and the database is really interesting.
Yeah, this is an amazing story. And thank you for going into like all these different areas that we can now dive further into. It's great. Yeah, so I think a couple of them that were really interesting here is the sharing publicly while learning aspect. I've talked about this a few times with other people on the podcast, and I think as well, like my journey was kind of similar with that too. I wrote a whole bunch of blog posts about serverless and building serverless applications, and it kind of gave me this like thing that I could stand behind and say like, here's this thing that I've done. Here's like the evidence of that experience. And then also, as you said, when you say something publicly, people will come and try to, say, oh, that's potentially not exactly 100% correct. And so, then you
Yeah,
have
you
to,
have feedback and discussions.
yeah,
Yeah.
you have to dive way into it. You got to read the documentation, and you have to spend, you might have written or wrote that piece in, 5 minutes, that paragraph, and you spend an hour or 2 hours trying to figure out how to answer the question that they just asked. Yeah. So I love that. So for those listening, do you want to kind of talk a little bit more about what some of the benefits are of, because some people, they have that mental barrier where they think that they don't have enough experience to share what they're learning publicly. What would you say to those people?
Yeah. First, it depends. I mean, it's different for each one. I will take an example. I started to answer on forums, and then I wanted to start a blog. But I was exactly in this mood where I was reading a lot from gurus. And then I was like, I have nothing to say. And then I've seen a blogger in about Oracle databases, very famous, Jonathan Lewis. And I've seen that he mentioned in his blog that someone has translated one of his posts in Chinese, and then he has put the link to it. And then I got the idea. I asked the permission to translate a few blog posts in French, my native language. And then I started like that, not with my content, just translating for the French people have difficulties to understand it in English. And when you start that, after just 5 or 6 translation, then you realize that you want to say the same thing, but maybe say it differently with your own words, your own experience. And this is where you realize that you have something to share. Even if the same topic has been touched by many people, the way you show it, the way to talk about it, that's different. And then you have readers who will prefer that.
Yeah, no, this is a really good point. I know someone else who is been thinking about doing that for another language as well, and that's exciting. So hopefully they're listening and they get that kind of confirmation to try it out. You know?
And even if English is the international language for IT, there are a lot of people who are not comfortable in English, so better translated. And also, they will not ask a question in English on a blog post
Mm.
and something in their language. I did French, but there are so many Spanish speaking countries and not so much content. So yeah, that's a good idea to start and to realize that it's easy to share. And what I would say is it's always good to go out of the comfort zone. And for example, this is what I'm doing there. A podcast is not where I'm the most comfortable, but it's really interesting, and we have a discussion that is interesting. So always good to go out of the comfort zone. There is nothing to lose. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And also to touch on that too, I'm the host. I'm supposed to also be just like super comfortable doing
Yeah.
podcasts, and I think that I'm not either. Like it's like you show up, you do it, you get yourself out of the comfort zone, you talk to new people, learn all this new information, and insights come out of that are really cool, and new pathways and friends and stuff. So yeah, definitely encourage everyone listening to also give a talk at a meetup, write a blog article, dip your toe in it, try it out, and I think good things could happen out of it. So, yeah, and one other thing to touch on there was you said answering questions was really useful. Was that more of like a Stack Overflow thing, or on your own content? And is there a pathway to potentially learning where someone could start doing this to almost get like repetitions in for how to think about stuff more deeply on whatever they're interested in?
For me, I started on a specific forum of databases, but what I really liked, I have something special in the way I work. I know a lot of people, DBAs in databases, but in many places, I know a lot of people. For example, in databases, they have their own script that they always use. And that's something I've never did. I always rewrite maybe the same queries, but this forces me also to learn new things. In the forums, sometimes you see always the same questions and you also see people answering and kind of upset of seeing always the same questions like did you search or do you know Google and all that, without realizing that searching on Google is not easy if you don't have a small knowledge about what you are looking for. And I really enjoyed that. May sound strange, but I really enjoyed answering the same questions again and again because my answers were better and better, or if not better, maybe smaller. Because when you do it several times, then you do it better, and that was something also I learned. Is that you can repeat things in IT? I don't like to repeat. I will spend more time trying to program something rather than repeating. But when it's about talking to people, explaining something, you have always some different way to put it.
Yeah, this is a really good point, and something that I've also seen on the forums. I think everybody that's a programmer that's been on Stack Overflow or in a specific database forum or the specific area that you're in, there is comments like that, and that sometimes it's disappointing because it's the first thing that someone sees when they're trying to learn, because they're searching for questions, they're searching for answers, so they're trying to learn, they're trying to understand. But you pointed something out that's really good, which is sometimes when you don't know the question to search, you don't know the vocabulary of the thing that you're in. You don't know how to put together to look properly.
I had someone I was teaching to really juniors in IT, And I had someone he told me, do not tell me to search on Google. It's like being in front of the sea and telling me just swim. It's too large. So as you say, if you don't know which words or also where to search, you have many things. On Stack Overflow, you have also wrong answer with high votes. And then you need to realize that maybe it's not the right answer, or maybe not in your context. Because it's easy also to take an answer for one context and think it works everywhere.
Yeah, this is a great point. It's something that we almost need like a course in like how to search and look for things and how to, because there is kind of there's an experience that you build up over time, and you've probably built it up. I've built it up a little bit as well, and it's like you go through Stack Overflow, for instance, and you look at the question or the answers, and you're like, you just start to build up that muscle. Where you're like, no, 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 okay, that's close, no, no, and then you're like, all right, this is the closest to it. You read the comment underneath it to confirm that they're not calling it out for not being right, and then from that you take it, you test it somewhere in a sandbox, and if it does work, then you kind of rewrite it your own way, put it into your program. But that's not like a natural flow, and people kind of have to learn, trip over things. So that's super interesting. On that front, with the junior in IT, and it sounds like you've kind of mentored and worked with people that are more on a junior level too. How do you go about kind of introducing someone that's more on that junior spectrum to some of the more advanced things that you might be working with?
That's a really difficult question, because what I've seen also with juniors, there is also a difference. You were mentioning searching on internet or Google, and what I've seen, I'm the generation where I started to work without internet, so with book for the knowledge. And then when Google was there, it was not Google, it was Alta Vista. Or then it was like everything, you can have any information, and this is where I learned to search. But for example, I see that my kids do not know how to search, because they are born in a place where the content is there. You don't have to look for it. And that's also something that I see with younger people, juniors. The way of searching is not the same as the one I'm using, and it's not the same as older people are using. So you need to know the different tools and see which one can help you.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Like you would think that because of the generation growing up with technology, all the answers out there in the universe kind of already been thought about and accessible, that they would be more able to search and find those answers. But it's the now it's almost like a mountain of content, and I know that every day, even and specifically, I'm sure this is happening, and even for very small areas too that we both work in, where it's just like at first it was like not a lot of content, and you're like, oh, I wish it would mature a little bit more, and then it starts maturing and people start learning about it, and then you get this like flood of content, and then it's trying to sift through what things do I look at, what things do I take, and then if it is actively maturing as well, how do I know if this is up to date or not up to date, and if I'm implementing a best practice of like November 3rd of 2021 or a best practice of 2019.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The date is very important, and if you find a blog post without a date, then you don't even know, yeah, if it's still the right answer. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing that was kind of coming up in this as well was when you have something like if you have two paths to go, do I get like a general skill set or do I go more to like a niche? Sorry. And what are your thoughts on that? It sounds like almost maybe you've gone the route of a niche versus more like trying to understand all of it. You've kind of like narrowed down into databases and into specific databases from there, and then built up a huge thing out of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, but that's also when I started on databases and on Oracle, I was lucky that it was a technology where you can stay for many, many years and then go into the detail. And today that's very difficult, because today if you learn a new technology, you don't know if it will still be there in 2 or 3 years, and that's not easy. And I've seen that also when I started to look at other databases, I was like, should I go there or not? And for example, when Hadoop was there, and I was doing some big data things, but in relational databases, and I was like, should I completely move to Hadoop or not, or wait to see what happens? And finally, I didn't really do the move, just looking at it. Today, with distributed databases, I really feel that it's the time to move there, because I think that will stay for a long time, because we are moving in this. Or for example, Kubernetes, at the beginning, you could have the same idea, but today we know that it is something that will be there and stay. Of course, on databases, I was late on Kubernetes because it didn't make sense before having stateful sets to put databases on Kubernetes. But today it's the way to go with cloud, with the way we need to scale and not care about which server we run on.
Yeah, yeah, and this is interesting because I've gone through that similar decision too, which is like, I was learning serverless on AWS, and I saw like cloud offerings from like GCP and from Azure, and I went like, oh, like now I think Cloudflare even has functions. Like it was like all these new things were popping up. It's like, okay, do I go this direction? Do I stay where I'm at? I think luckily, the offerings from AWS in the serverless realm have been the most mature and continue to be that way. But yeah, it was definitely that point where I could have easily started on like the GCP side or on the Azure side or somewhere else completely. Made that my niche, and then maybe not had as much of the momentum that I have currently because luckily AWS has kind of been winning in that department. Yeah, so that's very interesting. So if you can identify something that is like a more of a macro trend, like you said, Kubernetes, the idea of distributed databases, maybe the serverless offerings from like AWS now.
Yeah.
How do you think about that in terms of, and even more broadly in terms of like projects that are starting to pick up in the open source department, or even packages that you might include in programs? When you're evaluating something like that, what type of things do you look for in with the idea of like longevity? Like this is going to be around for many years, and so I should really put focus into this.
I don't think I'm really good to know it. So this is a place where I listen to others and I see how I feel it. But that's very difficult, because I mean, if it's technical, I can have an idea if something is just a crazy idea that looks cool and will not stay, or if it's really the good concept to stay on it. But decisions are not only technical. Huh? IT is also like fashion. Huh? And if people like the product just because it looks cool, or just because Google is using it, and and then everybody are going there. But that goes fast, but it can also end fast. So no, I'm not completely good at those things. I think I was lucky. For example, working on the Oracle database, I was lucky and starting to slowly look at Postgres, and that was also the right way when for open source databases. So yeah, I think it was more luck. So I've not a lot of advices on that.
Yeah, this is great. I think there is like a sliver of as a advice in there, which is be cautious and do a lot of research and look for the people that are maybe at the top of the field. Listen to
Yeah.
what they say, and then keep listening to all the other people until eventually you can start seeing a pattern form. And that might not be an easy overnight thing, but yeah, okay, awesome.
Yeah, that's what's nice. Also, going at conferences where you see different kind of people. You see the juniors coming to new technology and excited with it, and you see those old guys always wanted to use the same thing, and then you listen to everybody and you get an idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, we have reInvent coming up here at the end of the month, and so I'm sure there'll be a lot more things coming down the pipeline for everything.
Yeah,
All thousand services that AWS offers at this point.
yeah, too
Um,
many. Just remembering the name is too difficult.
oh yeah, have you done the that logo test thing where you basically like there's some type of game where it shows you just a random
Yes.
logo? So hard, so difficult to do. Um, getting actually to a question that's very near and dear to my heart, which is like when it comes to serverless and databases and choosing a database, um, serverless maybe 2019, maybe a little bit of 2020, and definitely before that, trying to work relational databases into like with Lambda and connection pooling. Those things were kind of difficult. Have you seen that area develop more? And now, if you were talking to somebody that might be building a serverless application, would you steer them on AWS? Let's say, would you steer them towards like DynamoDB or towards like relational database? And how would you help them kind of make that decision?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing because for the database, everything is different. I really like DynamoDB because it's easy, but there are limits. The problem is that a database, you put your data on it, so you need to know where your data is, and you also need some cache. And databases have evolved to have a lot of cache and efficient cache, so that when you need to read data, you don't have to go to the disk. And if you are truly serverless, because this term can be used also for many things, if you are truly serverless, you have disks, but you don't have a server with the memory that will keep your data in case you will query it or change it later. And we see that with DynamoDB. You can scale because data is sharded in many places, but each get will have to go to the storage, except if you add another service like the accelerator on top of it, but which then is a server with memory. And so really depend on the use case. There are use cases where what you want is predictable performance, and 2 milliseconds is always okay, and that's perfect. And there are use cases where you need more. On the other side, you have also Aurora, which is a real relational database with memory and a lot of things that are shared, and many sessions connecting to it. And they have also a serverless offer, but it's still a database that is up with all that. It's just that the database can be stopped automatically when you don't use it, or just lower the CPU consumption. But really depends how you see serverless. The first thing people want to see is the billing side of it. You don't want to see any server in your bill. So if you use DynamoDB, you will pay for data at rest, the storage, or in transit, the network and the get input, but you don't pay for servers. And but this is not technical. It's because you don't want to invest in servers. But I'm not really sure that it solves all problems, because to lower the bill, then you will reserve some throughput, and then you will start to think about the capacity.
Yeah,
But
thank you. Oh yeah, yeah. So I was gonna jump in because there's so much good stuff there. And the second that you said that once when you need a cache and then you have DynamoDB and now you're including a different service and then there's a server, the first thing that jumped in my mind was like complexity. Like there's so much complexity that can end up happening. And that's like a really important note with this is that especially on the billing side too. So I think sometimes when we do calculations for like how much it costs to run something, engineering time is like never considered.
yeah,
Of course it's considered, but like the biggest thing is like how much did that cost for the read and write, but how long did it take for us to actually get this thing stood up and then have it actually be performing and actually serving the customer need? And that amount of engineering time could sometimes exponentially outweigh the cost of the data transaction. Maybe at scale it ends up paying back off, but definitely for people that aren't like super huge enterprise companies that have already established user bases and all that stuff, you can almost trip over these things as you're building up, and not really calculate the full cost, I guess, of all this stuff. So yeah, so with that out of the way, then I guess when it comes to something like Aurora or serverless Aurora, does it come down to like what your team is already comfortable with skill wise when it starts going the do I use DynamoDB or do I go with a more of a relational model? And what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you decide there?
The problem is really that this decision usually do not look at the whole life cycle of the application and the data, because we are talking about databases and data stays longer than applications. And then usually I see the decision taken because it's easy to start. And of course, you are just a startup and you need to store some data, and it's very easy to start with those services like DynamoDB. But then you will pay it later because you have some limitations, and then you need more code, and that's easy when you start. But this code you will have to maintain it, and this is where people are. I, I will say coming back to relational databases, not for all use cases, but it was like putting everything on NoSQL and then realizing, oh, this use case, this use case, this use case, it's not so easy to manage on that. And this is where it comes back to relational databases, where it may take longer to start, but when you have a good schema and you put data on it, then you know that your data will stay, and you will not have to add more codes later, because it's not only about the structure, but also all the verification and the constraints. In a relational database, of course, you have to think about the data model, but when the data model is okay, you don't need code to check all many small business rules because they are enforced in the database.
Yeah, this is a really good point. Just to rewind back to easy to start with DynamoDB for like let's say a startup. Then as things start progressing, you have backend code that was written to handle that, and then it's like, oh well, we need this other index to search it in a different way, and then maybe we like back up our data, and then we create a new table that has that index, and then we find a different way, and maybe we're like there ends up being a lot of like, I don't want to use the word complexity over and over again, but a lot of complexity ends up popping up for sure. And I think, I've seen that personally in the past 2 years, basically the start of DynamoDB happening and then almost what felt like was going backwards, going back to relational because they were from relational to NoSQL, and then now coming back to it. But when you flag some of these things down and when we start going, okay, easy to start, which is good in some cases because getting easy wins is important. But then as it really scales out, you got 20 plus developers that are working on stuff. You have huge data requests coming through to the database, and you need that to be efficient. Maybe you have business analysts in the background that don't know how to search NoSQL database, and they don't have all the tools they've had for the past 5+ years to be able to do
Yeah,
it.
and then you need more services, and you need
Yeah.
to move the data in many services. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and so you end up having this cascading like domino thing start happening, and it's almost like it's positive because that's a reflection as well that like this new adoption of, let's say, like building serverless applications with like Lambda or API gateway, and maybe you're using like AppSync and GraphQL, and then you have DynamoDB in the background, and you start to hit up against those walls, and then now you have other teams that are now starting to adopt it, and they're going like the organization as a whole is like, wow, this is great, let's keep building applications this way. And then, oh, hey, what's going on with the database? Why are we, like, why are we hitting all these like issues, and why are we being throttled? And like, like how do we do reviews, and how do we share the DynamoDB code properly to interact with the database? And all those other things can start like adding up. And then, as you said, out of that, you need new services, you need new platforms, new products, and yeah. And so I guess to that end, if somebody was already working with a relational database, and they were starting to adopt serverless, is it kind of one of those things where you might attack maybe the more like Lambda services first, API gateway services, and then start working in like a relational database? Or if they were just getting their feet wet, would you still recommend them to start with DynamoDB as it might be like the easiest option? Like, where would you go in that
It
scenario?
also depends on the database, but for example, if you just have to store documents, you can store them in any Postgres compatible database as JSON or in Oracle, or the relational databases have also evolved to store also documents. So you may also have the same kind of API, because that's also what people like with services like DynamoDB, a simple API. And for me, coming from SQL databases, it was amazing to see that it was last year when AWS added some SQL on top of DynamoDB with Particle. I was like, cool, finally we find SQL everywhere, because that's the case. We find SQL as an API everywhere. And I've seen a lot of serverless developers used to the simple API, and they were like, oh, but that's dangerous, because if you don't use the right where clause, then you will scan the whole table. And yes, that's right. And finally, they prefer the limited API because it prevents doing bad things. And for me, it's kind of strange, like limiting the features. I mean, larger feature should be better, but when it is about starting a project or new technology, and of course it's not easy to learn and understand everything from the beginning, and then the simple API is also interesting. And that's also something that evolves. For example, today I was looking at an open source proxy where you have a MongoDB API that stores in Postgres. Probably something similar to what AWS is using in DocumentDB. And that's perfect, because you have your application using a simple API with put and get, but you can store it in a relational database. And then you can start to have, again, one database, but many APIs rather than many services. And that's a choice. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but if you have one service that can serve and be performant for many use cases, it may be easier to manage for small or medium companies that cannot have a full team knowing DynamoDB, a full team knowing Aurora, and that.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. And so I guess there's two things. So maybe let's tackle it first with the abstraction side of the conversation. With something like what you just mentioned around DynamoDB and SQL querying, does it start to get to the point where that abstraction, it's almost like people are asking for it, but it's almost like mixing two different concepts together, and then that makes the water very murky. Is it like, should we have a strong boundary of like, that if you're going to use DynamoDB, use it in this way? It's going to be different. It's going to require like retraining, all that stuff. If you're going to use relational, use it in this way. Do some of those abstractions end up hurting it more than helping?
Yeah. That's something we see, because first, when I heard about SQL on top of DynamoDB, I was like, cool, because I like SQL, but it's again a different SQL. And having been working with many databases, there are no SQL that are equal. You have the standard that guides some syntax, but everything is different. And then, yes, as you say, maybe if you have n services and n APIs on n services, then you start to have a lot of combinations. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I guess in that case, would you lean more towards like, if you're going to choose NoSQL, DynamoDB, like go all in that direction if you can, or if you're going to go relational and use a specific database there, go all in there, versus kind of mixing. And because you mentioned one thing around, once you have like a team and then they're trying to learn DynamoDB, and then the new database pops up and they're trying to learn that too, and then it's just, does it get too much, and should you just go all in on like a single choice until it
From my point of view, yes, because in SQL today you can do everything. For example, if you take Postgres, it's the most close to the closer to the SQL standard, and it has all features, even for analytics, even for documents, all that. So from my point of view, but also because it's easy, because I know it. I mean, there are many choices where the good answer is use what you know. For example, when I was in consulting, and for example, for databases, I know a lot of people, especially for vehicle database, they are like, it must run on Linux, not on Windows, even if it can. And I'm not with this idea, because uh, I like running a database on Linux because I know Linux, and I know that I have tools to troubleshoot, to look at the performance there. But if a company is running everything on Windows, they know Windows, they don't know Linux, so their solution will be on the OS they know. And going to the cloud, we have the same thing. If people know some services, maybe they prefer to use those services, even if they are not the most optimal for their use case, but because they know them. And it's not one more item to have, one more skill to ask to their people. I don't know in your place, but I see in Europe, for example, the companies, it's very difficult for companies to hire people, because there are so many companies hiring, and so many technologies, and small companies, big companies can build teams, but a small company must have in IT full stack developers, knowing many technologies that change, and that's very difficult. So sometimes sticking to the few technologies that you know, and 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 then I have no name for it. I mean, if someone knows perfectly DynamoDB and knows the tricks to get good modeling on it, then that's perfect. But if someone knows relational databases and think he need to use DynamoDB, but try to build tables like he was doing in a relational database, that will not be very good. And the opposite is the same. If you take a relational database and all that you create is a table with a JSON and nothing else, it's not the best. So you can do everything. You have many APIs in the database, but it's better to stick to the one that you know.
Yeah, this is really good because I think it's something that often, almost in every category, it seems like the more that you learn about it, the more you go like, oh, it's definitely not black and white. It's definitely more of a gray area. And unfortunately, that's not, I think as humans we want that like yes, no, like the this or this type of
Yeah.
thing. But it sounds like unfortunately, like everything else, we can't be that hyper specific. And so
And you have also
yeah.
to balance in your choice. You have also to balance between the technologies that are boring but works, and interesting, but may not work, or may not be there for the next years. And you need also to be in the middle of that, because working with boring technologies that works, okay, it works, but if it's boring, you find nobody to work on it.
Yeah, this is a good point because also going back to the consulting part of this conversation, when you're interacting with someone that maybe you're consulting and there's a team of people there, one of the architects or maybe even a DBA or even a developer, like somebody's bringing up a new database or a new technology. How do you kind of like frame that conversation to almost because in your mind you might already be spinning and going, okay, well, the team doesn't have experience with this. It's a huge shift. How do you handle conversation in a scenario like that? Where do you let them experiment with it for just a little bit, try it out? Do you veto it?
Yeah, there is the experiment, but experiment, it just saying the tip of the iceberg. I mean, for example, I think that MongoDB was really good, and got success because it was really good at listening to developers, which is something that the other databases didn't do. listening to developers. What do you want? We have it. And developers do not ask for secure backups. They just ask for something that is easy to develop with. And they offered that. And and then they have improved the things in the back, but it was listening to users. But after a while, if you took decisions only on the first development, then you may have some problems because your data will be in something that has to handle failovers, that has to handle migrations, restore and disaster recovery and all that. So experimentation is good to get an idea about the development, but it's also, I know nobody does it, but it's also good to look at the documentation and the concept and the architecture. I mean, a database can be cool, but if I do not understand how it stores data, then I have a problem because I will put data on it that is important for me. And if it's a black box, then that's difficult. And this is also why open source databases, you see the code that will process your data. And that's really cool. I've been working with Oracle where we don't see the code that process the data, but it's there for years and years and years. Or, for example, Aurora, you don't see the code and you don't even know how it works in behind because they do not document that. But it works for a lot of companies, then you have this trust. But a new database, if it's just a very cool API and I don't know what is behind, I don't think it's a good idea to to move there.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
But that's not difficult to explain when people are driven by the developers who want something to add a line in their CV, or the architect who wants the last thing he has read in a paper. So
No, it's a really good point. I know it's a joke, but it's actually it's partly a joke, partly not a joke around the CV thing, and adding, fluffing your resume up. I think we see this all the time as well. It's like, and I've been part of that as well early on in my career, where I was looking at options, and I think I even got buy-in, to be honest, from who I was working with at the time. That was like, yeah, go to the new thing because then we can like talk about it. So
yeah, yeah,
it's like, so like they gave me approval to do it, but also like those early days, like immature services, if you start adopting, like I adopted, not to throw any shade towards the AppSync team, this was like right when it was released. So like within like a month, I was using AppSync, and I remember being so frustrated and in the documentation and not knowing what to do and on the forums and trying to reach out to the product team that actually built AppSync and trying to figure it out, that a whole bunch of time ticked by. I, of course, gained a whole bunch of knowledge about AppSync at a very low level, which was good for the rest of my career and still is today. But in terms of the actual project and customers and the actual overall business and who was actually like what the point of doing the development actually was, that sometimes can get sidelined by exactly what you just said, the CV, and so how do you combat that? Like, how do you like? Because I can imagine, like, if we were going to play a scenario or a big company, there are these things being tossed out that people want to jump into. Maybe let's make an entire Kubernetes migration or something, which obviously we know takes a lot. As management, you hear this and then you're trying to go, okay, do we go this route? It sounds cool. How do you have an evaluation process where you don't make that wrong step? Is it, yeah, how would you, what would you do there?
yeah. I would say that I never really had to take the decision because in consulting I was more showing the different alternatives, and at the end, so the valid alternatives, and at the end they choose. But it's sometimes very very difficult, and it really depends on the culture of the company. I don't really have a solution for that. And yeah, so it depends on the company. For example, I've been working 1 year and a half at CERN, and it's a big research academic where there is a lot of politics, a lot of people, and there of course, you have many decisions that are taken also for different reasons, and you can say anything; it will go the way it goes. And for the good and the bad, there are also good things in trying new things, but it's very different. I've been also working with small companies. When you have a small company and they take a consultant for 2 or 3 days of expertise, then they will not discuss for 1 hour about something. If you just say, "I know that this works," they will take it. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I just thought about. Is there's a kind of a everything is a gray area, so it's like even with this, right? Like if we think about the counter side to it, I've definitely been in environments, as a consultant as well, where the amount of approval process and six different gatekeepers, double management review, stuff like that, it almost it can discourage people that might have good ideas to almost not share them. And so almost that idea of let's stick with what works can almost run the risk of losing like really talented people that are trying to bring good ideas to the table. And so you almost have to be conscious of that too. It's a very complex thing.
I've
Yeah,
always preferred small companies. And went at CERN, I knew it that it was a very big company, but it was also like a dream. But yeah, I know where I'm happy and comfortable in small companies where with clever people who trust each other and no politics on it.
awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. So I guess like as we're coming to like towards the end, let's jump into Yugabyte a little bit. You're a developer advocate there. You've been interacting and working with them for a bit. What is Yugabyte DB? If you had to give people kind of an idea pitch for it, and if they should include it in their applications or evaluate it, yeah.
So the idea of Yugabyte DB came from from Google Spanner. Everything started from Google Spanner, where Google had a lot of applications on NoSQL on Bigtable, and as I mentioned before, it's easy to start, but then you realize you need a lot of code to work around the lack of transactions, the lack of referential integrity, the lack of joins. And this is where Google had the idea to build a database that has the same scalability as NoSQL, easy to shard, but with SQL features on it. And Spanner has limited SQL features on it and runs only on the Google Cloud. And then others came like CockroachDB, for example, with more SQL features. And at that time, then the idea of the Yugabyte DB founders, who came from Facebook and Cassandra and Database, their idea was if the future is to have this scalability with lot of SQL features, then rather than building them and putting them one by one, and that can take years, the idea was to take Postgres, so the most popular open source database with a lot of features and extensibility to build new features, and to plug a distributed storage on it. So distributed storage, and then you have all nodes that are equal. So this is very different from having a primary database and standbys or even readers. For example, in Aurora, you can have 15 instances of the database, but only one will be writing, the other are only readers. With a distributed engine, you can connect to any node and you can read and write on it as if you see the whole database. And in behind, of course, there are a lot of technology and algorithms to manage the consensus, because you can have transactions that touch data in many nodes. So the idea is really on the top, the query layer is Postgres. You connect, you don't even need a specific driver. You connect with the Postgres driver, and you can take your Postgres data model and just import the dump in Yugabyte. But instead of storing in Postgres tables, the heap tables and the indexes, instead of that, it stored the rows in the distributed database that is a key value database called DocDB. It's based on RocksDB. So each shard of a table is a small RocksDB database. And then you have a consensus to manage first, because you have replication also between the nodes for high availability. So to manage that, you write to the quorum so that in case you have one node down, you know that you can still read consistent data from the other nodes, and that's the idea. So it's really growing. We have for the moment we have a lot of customers who are coming from Cassandra, for example. So this kind of customers coming from Cassandra, they want the same scalability, but they want more features like relational table, foreign keys, secondary indexes, procedures, everything that you find in Postgres, and they go there, and we are moving very fast in implementing all the features. So for the moment, for example, we have only optimistic locking, which you find in new applications, and especially applications built to scale on that. But if you want to take legacy applications that have been built for Postgres, for example, then there is a point where you will need to lock the rows and wait rather than get a message and retry. And those things we are implementing them. So what is really cool also is after I've been working on a old that mature database, I'm now involved in really a new thing where it's going. I think it's going for the future because we need distributed database. We need to scale to more than one node for a database, as we need it with the applications, and then it's coming, and it already works, and the extensibility of Postgres, and also it's open source. And that's also something very important, because we have people who contribute. If they need one more feature, they can do it also.
Yeah, all that is amazing. Actually, I think you. I'm sure the audience completely loves that you just broke down as well, and around like the things like Aurora, one write instance, so you have 15 total. 14 of those are read instances. That's so cool to hear that, like how the under workings of Yugabyte DB actually operate, and the idea of distributed storage, and kind of how revolutionary that sounds. That's pretty awesome. If somebody was
And I
oh, go ahead.
discovered that recently. For example,
Mm.
I never tried to run a database on Kubernetes before. And now it's native, because all nodes are equal. So you just you scale up the pods, and then you scale your database without having to think about, I must redirect the writers to the primary one, and all that.
Yeah, that's just fantastic. The question I had pop in my head is around, like, let's say, people that are listening, maybe cloud developers working on AWS. They're hearing good things about Yugabyte DB. Maybe they're already using something like Dynamo or Aurora, and maybe they're at that point where they're like, yeah, let's start looking at this as like a real option. Do they just go about deploying this into their AWS account? Can it be completely, offline, where they're running everything in like a private AWS account with no external access? How does all that stuff play out?
Everything is possible. So that's also what is cool. You can deploy it really as you want. Of course, you can deploy it on AWS, and we have many customers on AWS, because when it is about infrastructure, that's perfect. And you can deploy it on EC2 instances, but you can also deploy it on Kubernetes. And same for all clouds. And you can also deploy it on premises in Kubernetes or not. You really have the choice. Each node, as long as you install the software on a node and it's up, and of course nodes can talk to each other, then you can do whatever you want. Even multi-cloud. For example, we have a customer. He has some nodes in Azure and some nodes in Google Cloud. And that's their choice for some reasons. I don't know if they will stay like that, because it has also a cost. You need to pay for the interconnect between the clouds. But you know that you can choose. And also,
Like,
if there is a very big failure in the cloud or some limits, for example, uh, yeah, those customers are usually in retail where you have this Black Friday, and I mean, if you run on AWS, are you sure that there is enough power for the Black Friday of Amazon itself and all the people who have this activity on it? So having a few nodes in another cloud, you know that you can also scale there. That's crazy. That's not for all enterprises, of course. So the big ones in retail, but there is a need for that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's something too. It's like you said, like the big companies that their site's down Black Friday, it's down for 15 minutes and they're losing millions of dollars already,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's crazy. So when
And
it comes, oh
with the
yeah, go ahead.
application, they do that for years. With the application, it's easy to scale quickly. And now we need to do the same with the database, but of course we need a database that is able to shard the data and reshuffle the data when the topology changes.
Yeah, and to this, one more question I have before we get to that wrap up point. Is there a fully managed version of this? Because I know that you mentioned Kubernetes running it yourself or EC2. Is there any type of things like that in the works or already
Yeah,
exists?
yeah. So the database itself is fully open source, even the enterprise features like encryption and backups and all that. But of course, there is a commercial offer because there are people in the company working on it. And the commercial offer is the management part of it. Means that you can install it yourself and install a big cluster on Kubernetes, but of course you will have to manage it. There are things that are done automatically by Kubernetes, but others not. For example, if you lose worker nodes and their storage, you have to add them, for example. And for that, we have a platform. So that's commercial. We have a platform to manage it easily. And we have also a cloud. So the cloud was announced in September. So we have also a cloud where you just provision a database. On the cloud you choose. You choose, for example, AWS, and you can see any region. So you put it where you want. And it is managed, means that if you want to upgrade, for example, you just click upgrade and it will rolling upgrade the node. If you don't have the platform or the cloud, you can still do rolling upgrade, but you have to manage it or automate it yourself, because depending on the replication factor you have, you can have only one node down. So if you start to doing it manually, but you stop more nodes that you can before starting them, then the database will stop. So the advantage of the managed platform, whether it is just the software or the cloud, is that this is automated.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that ties back into that engineering cost thing that we talked about. Trying to build the cost of like, oh, do we pay Yugabyte DB to like run it for us and manage it, or do we try to save like the money, but actually you're not saving because you're having to invest hundreds of engineering hours to try to rebuild the same thing and then maintain it and then keep that knowledge, and then that person leaves, and then who knows how to run it, you know, and you're trying to scramble, and yeah, a lot of stuff can end up
And today
exposed.
we see that in the clouds. There are so many services. We need managed service.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, so as we're coming to a close here, is there anything that any final thoughts that you want to mention, or areas that you want to promote? Maybe you have talks or anything that's going on.
No, just saying that it's really good to get out of the comfort zone. And that's something, for example, I moved. For me, the big change when going to Yugabyte was that I have 20 years of knowledge on a vehicle. So after 20 years, of course, you have a bit of expertise, and that I don't use anymore. So I was like starting from something new, and all the things I knew, all my experience, like most of the lines in my CV, I don't use it anymore. But that's really nice, because then you realize that your experience is not only the technology that you have in your CV and the concept, the way databases work or are used by developers. Those things stay. So yeah, if for people listening and thinking about changing the kind of job or starting a blog or talking at conferences, just try it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing advice. And again, thank you so much for to being on the podcast.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, awesome. And to wrap up, for those listening, this has been the Talking Serverless podcast with Ryan Jones. If you like our show and want to learn more or hear more, check out Talking Serverless IO. You can also find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. If this was valuable, definitely let us know on Twitter so we can do more of that. And of course, we'll see you next time as we sit down with another fantastic guest.